Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Bom dia. Estamos dando início a mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nossa convidada é a historiadora norte-americana Wendy Goldman, professora da Universidade Carnegie Mellon e especializada em estudos sobre a União Soviética. Autora, entre outros livros, de Mulher, Estado e Revolução, publicado pela editora Boitempo em 2014, obra que aborda as mudanças sociais pelas quais passou a sociedade soviética. Entre as principais especializações da professora Wendy Goldman está o desenvolvimento da condição feminina após a Revolução Russa. Antes de começarmos a entrevista, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes de nosso canal no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa da sua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência, nosso engajamento e nossa receita publicitária. Outra forma de contribuição é através do Pix. Nossa chave é apoie@operamundi.com.br. Eu vou repetir, apoie@operamundi.com.br. A nossa razão social é Última Instância Editorial Limitada. Como essa entrevista foi previamente gravada, infelizmente não poderemos repassar as perguntas de nossos internautas à nossa convidada. Good morning, Professor Wendy Goldman. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor, this opportunity to interview you on the 20 Minutes International Show.
Thank you very much, Breno. It's an honor for me to be able to speak to a Brazilian audience.
Professor, to what extent the work of highlighted feminist militants like Kollontai and Krupskaya influenced the concrete changes to the situation of working women's living in Russia during and after the 1917 revolution?
I think it had an enormous effect on women's practical lives. The Russian Revolution was the first revolution in the world where women managed to organize not only on behalf of their class, but also on behalf of their sex. And those ideas about both class and sex came together in whole new ways during the 1917 revolution. Women within the Communist Party pushed very, very hard to create a separate organization within the party. That organization was known as the Zhenotdel, or Women's Department. And it had an enormous effect in doing practical work among both rural and urban women. So it was a very, very important organization. Second, the ideas that Kollontai, Krupskaya, Inessa Armand, and other working class women had, women who came out of the textile mills, for example, that had a big effect in the laws that were enacted in 1918 in the 1918 Family Code, which had within it probably the most progressive family legislation ever enacted in the world.
Was easy to establish this feminist position inside the Bolshevik Party? I mean, in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, there was just only women. Was there much resistance against this feminist point of view?
Well, one thing we have to understand is that when we talk about the Bolshevik Party, we're talking about a very large party. It's organized like a pyramid. At the apex, you have the Central Committee, but then as you go down, you have local activists at every level, people working in factories, in schools, in our rural areas. So when you ask about the issue of resistance, we have to think about, was there resistance at the top? Was it at the middle? Was it at the bottom? And I would say, yes, there definitely was resistance. There was especially resistance among working class and peasant men at the bottom. Let's just say their consciousness needed to be raised. And women had a job in terms of raising that consciousness. So that was a struggle that needed to be fought. But once the Genotdiel, the women's department, was established, it was then possible to, through a separate organization, begin organizing women at every single level in many, many different places, and to also begin struggling with that male backwardness.
Which was the behavior of the greatest Bolshevik leaders like Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin in front of these feminist issues?
Well, I would say that at least in the period of the 1920s, Bolshevik leaders strongly supported a program for women's liberation. It was enacted in law, and the Commissariat of Justice crafted that first legislation. It was fully supported by leaders of the party and by the government. So there was quite a bit of support. Now, how Lenin actually acted in his personal life, or how Trotsky acted in his personal life, this is another question altogether.
It's clear in your book, Human State and Revolution, that some measures implemented by the Soviet revolutionary government, such as the creation of daycare centers and authorization for divorcing, ended up creating contradictions for shocking conservative customs and concrete elements of humans' lives. How and why did this occur?
Well, one of the biggest problems that the revolutionaries had when they took power in 1917 was that they took power in an underdeveloped, poor, and devastated country. The country had also been further ruined by years of war and civil war. So that when they tried to enact a whole variety of social services based on this vision that household labor of women should be socialized and paid for, there was not a lot of capital to be able to put into social services. And that was one of the main contradictions that occurred. Another contradiction that occurred was that it was possible through the legislation for people to divorce very freely. People could come together and divorce simply by actually filling out a postcard at the registry office. So if you had a fight with your spouse and you got angry, you could march down to the registry office, fill out a form, and if your spouse wasn't there, they would be informed of the divorce by postcard. Many men took advantage of this very easy divorce procedure, and they often left women with many children to care for and no means of support. The 1920s was a period of very high unemployment, particularly for women. So this notion of free union, which is an idea that is wonderful in the abstract, when it actually was practiced by real people, it became very, very difficult for women. And there was a kind of reaction, I think, against it.
And what about children caring? I mean, I have read in your book and in other studies that there was a lot of experience of changing familiar caring of the children for some kind of state or cooperative or collective caring of these children. What happened with this experimental changes in classical family way of life?
Well, in the beginning, in 1921, there was a terrible famine, and there were millions of children that were left orphaned by the famine. The possibilities for caring for all of those children were very reduced. They simply did not have the money, the funding to be able to care for that many orphans. So that was one problem that they encountered very quickly. But second, many daycare centers were established, especially in the 1930s when women entered the labor force in very large numbers. And I would say that daycare became an important feature of Soviet life beginning in the early 1930s, certainly up through World War II, when women assumed the greatest share of work in the defense factories and in other places, and actually continued through until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So daycare became an important feature of Soviet life, and many, many mothers and fathers took advantage of it.
Beside children caring and the right of voting, which other measures would you highlight about feminist conquers in the Soviet Union?
Well, in 1920, the Soviet Union became the very first country in the world to legalize abortion. And that was a very, very important right. It was not really understood at the time as a right that women had, although I think women understood it that way. But then under Stalin, abortion was recriminalized. So abortion was prohibited again in 1936. And then in 1954, it was again made legal.
Mm-hmm. Besides abortion, what are the main setbacks suffered by working women during the Stalinist period? Why did it happen?
Well,
These setbacks.
Oh, go ahead. There were a number of setbacks. One is that there was a sense among the leadership that there was a lot of social chaos in the country. And in response to that chaos, the government resurrected an older notion of the traditional family. So there were stiff penalties levied on men who refused to pay alimony. There was this idea that was promulgated throughout the country that the best form of the family was a nuclear unit in which men and women assumed traditional responsibilities for the care of children. So earlier ideas about free union or free love, those ideas disappeared. And not only disappeared, but a lot of the people that had promulgated those ideas were in fact arrested. So that was one way in which the state took a step back. On the other hand, I will say that because so many women entered the workforce, and in that sense, they did not return to a traditional vision of women in the home and men at work, because so many women entered the workforce, there were daycare centers that were set up, there were dining halls where people could eat a hot meal. Just about everybody received a hot meal at work. That was the main meal of the day. It was subsidized. It was very, very inexpensive. And these things did lift some of the burden from women's shoulders.
Is there any connection, any proved connection between these setbacks and the reconnection between the government and the Orthodox Church before the World War II?
I don't think so, because the government did not really have a rapprochement with the Orthodox Church until a period during the war. So I don't think that the reason that the government moved to, let's say, reinstitutionalize some of the more traditional roles had to do with the Orthodox Church. The second thing was that the government was very concerned about the birth rate. They felt that the birth rate was falling. And so they began to glorify women that had many children. But of course, this was a ridiculous contradiction because women cannot have 10 children and at the same time go to work in a factory
And go to the war.
And at the same time, come home and take care of all of the household things. So this was something that was an enormous burden that was placed on women.
Which was the media approachment in the Soviet Union about the human role in the society, in the economy, and the war?
Well, the media, I would say, very much celebrated women's roles in new kinds of jobs. So, for example, there were famous women tractor drivers who were being celebrated all over the press. There were posters about them. And while we may think this is something that seems to us a little funny, for women that had never had the opportunity in rural areas to learn to master machinery, this was one of the more important jobs that you could have if you were a peasant woman living on a collective farm. So to see women in these roles was very important. In addition, in the early 1930s, the Genotiel was abolished. That was a step backward. But there were many women that still had this vision of what could be possible for women under socialism. And they formed what were known as regendering brigades. These brigades went into the factories and they went onto construction sites and into the coal mines. And they pointed out every single job, primarily skilled, higher paying jobs that could be done by women. And they said, this can be done by women. This can be done by women. And it completely revolutionized, in a way, the possibilities that working class women had in the places in which they worked.
Even during the Stalinist period, do you think that the Soviet women had more rights than the capitalists, than the women in the capitalist societies?
I think if we look at the period of the 1930s, for example, in the United States, if we take working class women, they were consigned to jobs in factories that were at the lowest possible level. They had no opportunity to enter skilled work. So in that sense, I would say that working class women in the Soviet Union had more rights. They had a lot of rights to maternity leave. In other words, when you had a baby, they had the rights to nurse a child in the workplace. These are rights that in many places in the United States we are still fighting for. And I don't know about Brazil, but I think there too, there are probably many working class women who do not have very good maternity leave and who do not have the right to bring a young child into the workplace and to have set nursing breaks to nurse the child. So there were important things that were passed that were very, very effective, I think, for increasing and bettering women's lives.
And what about formal education? Had the Soviet women raised up their level of education more than in the capitalist societies?
In the 1930s, there was an enormous push for industrialization. And as a result, there was great social mobility in the society. Everybody was going to school, and I mean everybody. If you were an elderly peasant who had never learned to write your name, there were many photographs of peasants in the newspapers, you could see their hands. They were so gnarled by so many years of work that they could barely open them up. Those people went to something called a lickpiez, which was the liquidation of illiteracy, and people learned to write their names. People learned to read. If you were at a slightly higher level and you already knew how to read and to write and you were working in a factory, there was school that people went to after work, where they learned higher skills They learned engineering or sub-engineering. They began to take many practical classes. So that was a period, I think, of great hope in many ways in the Soviet Union, where there were enormous opportunities for people to advance and to move up, to increase their skills, to increase their wages. And there was a sense also of great pride that people had in their children, because whereas, let's say, they had been illiterate peasants or working people, their children went to school. It was free. The university was free. And children became all kinds of things that they never could have dreamed of.
And about the role of the, about the Soviet human role in the war, was the same situation for the Soviet human than for the North American human? I mean, did they have the same role, or there was a different kind of approachment in those societies? I mean, in the capitalist society and in the socialist society, like the Soviet society?
Well, one thing we know is that the people that were, let's say, 16, 17, 18 years old when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, these young women had grown up in an atmosphere in which they were told that they could do anything. And they had also trained within their high schools in military drills and other things. So they learned basic skills. When the war began, many of these young women actually besieged the recruiting stations. And the recruiters did not know what to do with them because they were volunteering to fight the Nazis. And the recruiters didn't know, should they be enrolled in the Red Army or not? So there was a lot of confusion. The Soviet Union did end up enrolling a very large number of women within the Red Army. And they served all kinds of capacities. They actually even served as pilots. So this was a very big part, I think, of women's contribution to the war. And then, of course, many, many women stepped in to take over the jobs of husbands, brothers, sons who went to the front. And they stepped in to take over those jobs, and they began making a huge contribution in the defense industry as well.
Soviet women who were snipers or aviators was a myth, or they really existed?
They really existed. It turns out that to be a sniper, you need certain characteristics. You need to have a great deal of patience. You need to have a tremendous degree of bravery because they're frequently ahead of the front lines. You need to be able to wait. And of course, you need to have excellent eyesight. You need to be able to put yourself into a small area and camouflage yourself. It turns out that for all of these qualities, both women and men, there is a tiny percentage of the population everywhere that has these very specific qualities, but they are equally distributed. And probably as far as the patience, women may have even had a little bit more of that quality than men did. So they made excellent snipers.
Could the Soviet women arrive to the top rank in the Red Army?
I do not believe that there were any Soviet women who became marshals.
But colonels or generals?
I don't think so.
But was that prohibited, or just this didn't happen?
I don't know if it was prohibited. I'm not sure how the culture of the army affected women's promotions. And of course, after the war, I think there was a return, in a way, to civilian life. And many of the women that had been so active in the war, there was a kind of reaction against them. Popular society frequently called them, quote, frontline whores. There was a lot of concern about frontline romances and frontline sexual activity. And many of the women who I think deserved to be celebrated when they returned actually faced a very difficult situation.
I understand. Professor, after World War, sorry, after Second World War, these rights, which were abolished in the 30s or the 40s by Stalin, were these rights partial or fully recovered? Beside abortion, you have talked about abortion, but I mean, after the war, was some kind of rights recovering to what they were in the 20s?
No, they never recovered the full extent of that legal vision of women's emancipation. So, for example, in 1936, divorce becomes much more difficult to get. They never returned to what was known as the postcard divorce. And similarly, there were other things as well that they just never returned to. There was the idea that household labor would be fully socialized, and it never was fully socialized. Some of it was socialized, as I mentioned, with daycare centers and dining halls, but women really did assume a double burden. They both worked and they did most of the household labor in the home. So they never fully realized that part of the vision either.
Did the Glasnost perestroika period approach any kind of advance in human rights?
I think there were many ways in which Glasnost and perestroika returned to a less repressive set of rights, that where there was more transparency in society, where more things could be published and discussed. The newspapers became freer. Certainly, the idea of jailing people for art or for writing or for speaking or for demonstrating, those basic civil rights were very important during perestroika. So in that sense, we see a lot of advances. But at the same time, we see this weird contradiction, which is that many women were very exhausted by both working and by taking full responsibility for the household. And as a result, rather than seeing a new independent feminist movement arise, I think we saw instead a lot of very reactionary ideas that developed. And in certain ways, women even embraced those ideas. So when I was in the Soviet Union in 1984-85, I lived there at that time. I was doing research for my dissertation. And when I would say to women that I was a feminist, they would laugh. They thought that that was the worst thing you possibly could be. And I found that so strange here in the country of the revolution, where they had had the most progressive, radical program for women's liberation in 1917. There were women now that wanted nothing more to do with feminism.
And which was the reason?
I think the reason was that women felt that what feminism meant was kind of state feminism. And state feminism meant that you worked all day and then you came home and you worked at home. And I think that they were exhausted by it.
I understand.
I would say just one other thing also.
Of
The
course.
Soviet Union was never very good about consumer items. They did not produce very much in terms of the things that people like to buy. And I think
Microwave, refrigerators, and this kind of products that make life easier in the capitalist societies.
There was that, but there's also clothing, decent shoes, a pretty dress, a decent lipstick. I mean, these are things that something a little beautiful, not something necessarily so expensive like a refrigerator or a car, but just something that could maybe lift your spirits on a dark day, right? And I think that women had a kind of yearning for some of that stuff. So the very things that we in the West were rejecting as objects of women's oppression, namely high heels, makeup, this idea that we were supposed to look a certain way for a man, that we were throwing all that out the window. We didn't want any of it. And Soviet women were thinking, oh, that would be nice.
We'd like to have this.
A little bit, yes.
I understand. Makes sense. Makes sense. Professor, there are currently in certain sectors of the feminist movements an understanding that the socialist experiences of the 20th century would have very little or nothing to inform the current human struggles. What can real socialism teach, and what should we not repeat from these experiences in the struggle for female emancipation today?
Well, there were certain things that have occurred today. For example, gay rights, the rights of lesbian, homosexual, transgender people. This was not something that was an important part of the Bolshevik program. In fact, I would say they were almost completely blind to it. At the time, there was not great movements for gay liberation. We had to really reach, I think, the 1970s and 1980s. So I don't think that, in that sense, Soviet socialism has much to offer us at all. Second, they did not do a good job of producing contraception. And this is something that is absolutely essential if women are not going to be prisoners of their bodies. So the ability...
Wasn't that the anti-conception pill in Soviet Union?
Not much. No, they never produced decent contraception. As a matter of fact, they had the idea that if women were not impoverished, then they would want to have many children. So this notion that women may not want to have a child every time they have sex or to get pregnant, whenever, that idea really did not occur to the men in the party. And that's also an area, the area of sexual freedom, where I think they do not have much to offer us. But in other areas, I think they have a tremendous amount to still offer us. And one of those is the socialization of household labor. Right now, the way we have solved the problem of women working and of household labor is either by using immigrant women here in the United States and other developed countries, women from the Philippines, women from Brazil, women from Venezuela, women from Mexico, to come into homes of middle-class people here in the United States. They have no protections. They have no social security. They work for very low wages, and they do that work that middle-class women are unable to do. It's the same thing, I think, probably in Brazil. The upper classes employ lower-class women to do the work of that's called reproductive labor, so that they can have better, more interesting jobs.
And it didn't happen in the Soviet Union at all.
In the Soviet Union, there was some domestic service, but the minute people had an opportunity to do something else, they would do it. So, for example, if you were coming in from the countryside and initially you become a domestic servant, it was very easy to get a job in a factory that probably paid you twice as much. So there were many opportunities.
But it was legal to have a servant, home servant?
Yes, it was legal to have, and actually there were laws that regulated the treatment of servants. So in that sense too, that's something better. Frequently now, throughout the world, there are very few laws that actually regulate the treatment of domestic labor. So I think this idea actually of socializing this work as much as possible is a good idea. And for that, the parts of the work that are not socialized, to have them well paid, to have the people secure and protected, to have their hours set so that they don't end up working 12, 14 hours a day. All of these things I think are very important.
Comparing Russia today to the old Soviet Union in terms of human rights, better now, better before?
Well, under Stalin, it's very difficult to talk about human rights. People did not have the right to speak out about issues. You could be arrested even for telling a joke in 1937, which was the height of the terror. I think that people were very fearful in periods. I don't think that was as true during the Khrushchev period, but I don't think that there was the kind of freedom that's so important to human beings. At the same time, today also in Russia, there is an enormous amount of political repression, and we know that. Putin has a kind of lock on power. He's been in power for a very long time, and the ability for people to really protest against that in any kind of way is extremely controlled by the government.
But in terms of human rights and human standard of living?
And here, I think it depends a lot on what class we're looking at. So for people who are workers, for people who were in the rural areas, peasants, for people in large parts of the country, in small towns and villages that were never very well served, I think they have gone through a terrible, terrible period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, they were just literally beggared. Situation has gotten somewhat better, and I would say that's partly a reason for why Putin has so much popular support. It's because he did arrest the free fall of Russian capitalism, which was just a grab for resources. There is a bigger middle class now, especially in the larger cities, which I think lives better than it did in Soviet period. And of course, the extremes of wealth and of poverty are far greater now than they were.
I understand. Professor, how the discussion, in your point of view, how the discussion of topics such as free love, non-monogamous relationships, abortion, and social reproduction of work could contribute to deepening the feminine role in the workers' struggle against capital?
I think there are many, many ways in which women are now being used by international capital. And one of the ways I've already mentioned, and that is that because of globalization, we now have some of the lowest, least protected, and worst paid jobs are being done by people who immigrate to the United States, either legally or illegally. There is an enormous struggle that is going to have to take place about this. And the freedom of one section of humanity, namely the right to go to work, to have children, to have a home, to have it be clean, all of these things should not depend on the oppression of millions of others, of women who also have homes and children that they leave halfway around the world in order to be able to come to a place where they can earn money and send it home. So I think that's one thing, that the vision has got to encompass all women internationally. There are also very important things the vision said about women's opportunity in education. And in many parts of the world, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, other areas, in India, women do not have these opportunities. They don't have the opportunity to divorce. They don't have the opportunity to escape an abusive marriage. They cannot support themselves financially. They cannot support their children. In many cases, their children are taken away from them. They can be raped with impunity, and there is no punishment. So these are issues that exist both in the developed world and in the less developed world. And there's a new set of dependencies now that are emerging, and new sets of class relations, I think, that are also emerging, that are articulated internationally. Those are the things that a socialist vision really does address.
And what about these other issues I have asked you? I mean, we could ask, maybe we could classify these issues as civil or human rights. I mean, I'm talking about these issues that were in certain form inaugurated by the socialists, the 1917 revolution in Russia. I repeat, a free law of non-monogamous relationships, abortion. Are these issues important for this struggle against capital?
Well, I think the right to abortion is tremendously important to women. Is it possible to realize this right within a capitalist society? Yes, I think it's possible. Similarly, free love, or let's say the ability for people to not be financially dependent on each other, to be able to come together as they wish and to separate, that's something that's more complicated. I would say that this also may be able to be realized under capitalism. It takes, women have got to be financially independent in order for that to be realized. Can women be financially independent under capitalism? Yes. But there are other rights, I think, that have to do with class, that have to do with rights for all women, that cannot be realized under capitalism. And it's those rights that I think we lose sight of sometimes when we just talk about the right of a very small subset of women to be able to gain education, to be able to have someone else take care of their children. In a sense, it's the rights of the majority of women of the world that I think the Soviet vision really speaks to.
What is the Soviet feminists' legacy for the current moment of world feminism?
That's a difficult thing to say. There are certain aspects of the Soviet program that I think are very important now to world feminism. But I also think that world feminism is being taken in many directions that, let's say, the Soviets did not have much to say about. So, for example, transgender rights, the right of homosexuals to practice freely, without the interference of the state, without fear, without arrest. These were things that I think, these are new issues and important ones.
Professor, we are finishing this very interesting and exciting interview, and I would like to ask you two questions that I always ask to our guests. First question, what book have you read or are reading and would like to point out to our viewers? And which series or movie could you suggest to those who are following us?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. First of all, there's a wonderful new book that's out. It's right behind me. I will get it.
Okay. Be my guest.
So this book is about what happens in the period after World War II in the Soviet Union. It's by Mia Nakachi, and as you can see, it says the politics of reproduction in the post-war Soviet Union. So I think this is a very interesting book. I've just finished a book about World War II.
Okay.
It's called Fortress, Dark and Stern, the Soviet Home Front during World War II. And I think people would be very interested in this book as well. So, and as far as the series, well, I watched a very interesting series. It's called A French Village.
French Village.
Yes. It is on I believe it's on Netflix, although maybe not. Anyway, it goes through one French village during World War II, from the invasion of the Nazis all the way up through the post-war period. And it is fascinating.
Thank you very much. Professor Wendy Goldman, thank you once again for your kindness in accepting this invitation, the invitation to this conversation, which is certainly very interesting and exciting, I repeat, for our viewers and especially for me. Do you speak Russian?
Yes, I do.
Спасибо. That's the only word I can speak in Russian.
Well, Breno, thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity, and also for asking so many interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Wendy. Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nossa convidada foi a professora e escritora Wendy Goldman, historiadora, autora de Mulher, Estado e Revolução, entre outras importantes obras. Obrigado a todos e a todas pela audiência e um grande abraço. Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos, deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal, você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.